It is from me that all life is born. It lives only for me.
Right now, I think I am glad I met you all.
Xenoblade Chronicles, a series of complex emotion, engrossing character development, and the struggle for basic survival, and the right to carve your own path for two worlds separated by a madman's desire for the divine. That madman was Klaus. And the story of Xenoblade Chronicles up to this point could be ascribed as the story of Klaus and the result of his momentous decision as the earth hung on a knife edge. That singular action by Klaus would not only sunder Earth in twain, creating two unique destinies for each of these new worlds, but also tear them apart into two distinct entities. Two sides of the same coin, two resultants of a guilt-ridden conscience. Or maybe I should say, grief-ridden conscience. We'll get to that. Just keep that one in the back of your mind for now. Zanza, the side that gives into the madness and lets the delusion overtake him. And then we have Architect Klaus, the man whose guilty conscience guides his every action as he seeks to right the wrongs of his previous self. Both Xenoblade 1 and 2 culminate with a confrontation with their respective version of Klaus. In Xenoblade 1, Shulk and crew must muster the will to overcome Zanza's divine might, to reclaim the world, and use their might to fell a god.
Use our power to fell a god, and then seize our destiny!
In Xenoblade 2, Rex and crew come to accept Klaus and work together to save the world of all rest from the machinations of Torna. Each half of Klaus is handled fundamentally differently because each half walked different metaphorical paths as a result of their actions to use the conduit and split the world like a melon. And it is in this fork in the road that an interesting character analysis for Klaus can be done. Because remember, no matter how differently they feel as characters, they are two halves of the same whole. The resultant of what a slightly different mindset, coupled with a grand decision, can lead to. Because it's an examination not necessarily into evil itself, but the human conscience, and how it can cope or react to certain choices that we consciously make. Let's take Zanza for example. Zanza found himself in a boundless sea with no one other than Mayneth, having immense power as the result of the Monado. Zanzo, yeah, his brother. Zanza, reveling in his ability to split the world apart and to give birth to life itself on his body of the Bionis, submerges himself in this delusion, believing he and Mayneth to be gods of this new world. He reacted to splitting the world in half not with regret, but with jubilation. He was a god now, and his word was final. He not only ate but digested his own falsehoods that he peddled onto the masses. His pride and ego swelled to monolithic, get it, proportions, and his god complex became his entire being. But he was never the most powerful entity. Alvis loomed over him like a sword of Damocles. And there's an entire dissection of Xenoblade 1 to be done, as that its entire story relates to Gnosticism. But a quick TLDR is that Zanza thought himself to be the one true god, but in fact the real god was always just out of sight, or in this case, hiding in plain sight, buying his time. And Zanza, who believed himself to be God himself, was an entire tier down from true divinity. His delusions ensnared his very being and served as justification for all the decisions all those years ago. He was justified because he was the arbiter of justice. We pivot over to the architect, Klaus, and he had a fundamentally different takeaway from splitting the world in half. Regretting his actions and his pride that led to them, he resolved himself to set things right, to recreate the cycle of life, this time with his own method, the Titan Blade cycle. He would try and put in various failsafes in his new life cycle, specifically designed to prevent someone like him from ever gaining the means to do what he did. Redemption wasn't necessarily the play, but trying to do what good he could to let life continue to prosper was his goal, and he recognized that someone like himself was the biggest threat to life's survival. So he used his newfound power and what was in his capabilities to try and instill some good into this new world. However, like Niall said in Future Redeemed, people always just kill people. And even with his newfound life cycle, even with Titans and Blades now, war and death still followed, people still suffered, and eventually Malice was awakened and swore to destroy the world, fueled by the nihilism of Amalthus. Klaus lost hope. He lost hope not just in his redemption, but in any positive outcome. for the world and resigned himself to sit quietly in his little desolate skybox, doomed to watch the world he found precious tear itself apart, and for all those hard years of struggle and toil to become undone and have been undertaken for nothing. Once was a man fueled by a guilty conscience, to right the wrongs of his past as best as he could, now stuck in a depressive state and accepting the coming oblivion, hopeless that he had any ability to be better than his greatest sin. Both stories of Klaus deal with some aspect of religious aspect. Xenoblade 1 dealt with Gnosticism, and Xenoblade 2 dealt with Klaus's quest for reconciliation. Though I guess you could also argue that Xenoblade 2 dealt with agnosticism. Zanza's influence in Xenoblade 1 was very in-your-face. He was an active character doing things and scheming throughout most of Xenoblade 1. Hell, he was the primary antagonist at the end of the day. Whereas the Architect was the opposite. You really only meet him in the last chapter. Sure, you get glimpses of him up to that point, but his true nature and motivation remained largely a mystery, including the nature of his divinity. Amalthus didn't even really interact with him when he went up to Elysium. Just grabbed the core crystals and ran. Architect Klaus was a big question mark, whereas now we know he was just watching and overseeing everything, accepting the fate that awaited him. Remember though, Klaus and Zanza are two halves of the same whole. Let's bring back that discussion about grief. I told you to remember about this. There are generally 5 stages of grief, and I'm sure if you actually did research on this topic, or if you're more educated on it, it's way more nuanced than just this, and this is probably a very simplistic view on it. This is generally what people think of when we think of the 5 stages of grief, though. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These 5 stages compose the characters and stories of either Zanza or Architect Klaus. Zanza encompassed the anger and bargaining aspects. Zanza was furious at our efforts to usurp his divinity, or the sheer notion that his word could be challenged. But remember, at first he bargained with us, offering to let us join him. Architect Klaus embodied depression and acceptance. Like me right after an exam. God, exams. But Architect Klaus specifically embodied depression and acceptance during the undertakings that he did over the thousands of years prior, and realizing that it was all for naught, he became depressed, and then he accepted his fate, and accepted that Malus would destroy the world, because Klaus viewed himself as a failure. Thus bridges the gap between his depression and his acceptance, and Zanza's bargaining and anger. But you may be asking, Jmulls, hey, wait a minute, you can't count though. There's 5 stages. What about denial? Well, this one's a bit of an interesting one, because Zanza and the Architect embody that particular one in their own ways. Zanza was in constant denial right until the end, believing himself to be the one true god, while blissfully unaware of Alphys' true nature. Remember Gnosticism. Architect Klaus gets a bit tricky to nail down, but there are 2 aspects to him that embody denial. His previous worldview, that he himself could create a world free of people like him, and that life could be free of pain and suffering. He embodied that version of denial, that humanity and suffering often go hand in hand. He denied it, yearned to create a world, an Elysium without that. But closer to home and within the confines of Xenoblade 2, he was in denial that there was any hope in their world, willing to seclude himself away to become an agnostic type of god, not really interacting with his creations or letting things run their course. Heck, he never even really gave proof of life for himself. Both of these characters' aspects of denial can be viewed as a way to feed into their respective themes of Gnosticism and agnosticism. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects about Klaus and Zanza as characters, is that, sure, if you view them as individual characters, they're just as compelling by themselves, and they work exceptionally well with the story that they're in, and the story that's being told there. But if you pair them together and view them as one complete entity, split in two aspects of the same whole, then everything they do and think becomes far more clear. It's just the angel and demon on your shoulder if they were separated and forced to govern their own respective worlds. And a lot of their decision-making makes more sense when you view it through that lens. And that's one of the things that makes Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 so compelling of a series of games, in my opinion. It's because Xenoblade 1 and 2 dealt with different aspects of Klaus's fractured mind, whereas Xenoblade 3 was about bringing the pieces back together again, now that we're in a world without him, and dealing with the after effects of his decision all those years ago. It's why, to me, Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 will always be constituted as the Klaus saga, because really, all the storylines trace back to him in some way, or in some interpretation. And much like how the series began, with him splitting the world apart, Future Redeemed seemingly brings them back together again, putting a rather nice bow onto his own little story. Well, I say little. It's like 3 of the longest games in existence, coupled with DLCs and extra stories. The story of Klaus has largely, I believe, come to a conclusion, and the future of Xenoblade will be dictated by the characters that remain. But Xenoblade started because of one man's selfish decision, the desire to become a god, and his resultant decisions to react and deal with that singular decision. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Go play some video games if you can, and hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload in the future. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again.